It was a chilly autumn morning in Washington, D.C., the kind of day when the crisp air filled the streets with an urgency to get indoors. The hustle and bustle of the city had barely begun to settle when the courtroom doors swung open, announcing the arrival of one of the most talked-about names in the legal world, Jasmine Crockett. At just 36, Crockett had already built a reputation as a sharp, unconventional, and passionate attorney. Known for her unorthodox methods, she often found herself at odds with both the law and her peers. But that never stopped her from winning cases. It wasn't her career achievements that had her standing in front of Judge Arthur Banks today, however. It was something far more complex. Judge Banks was a man known for his strict adherence to the law. His courtroom had a reputation for order and discipline, and he didn't tolerate any deviations. His face was stern, his demeanor commanding respect. For him, the law was black and white. No exceptions, no leniency. Yet today, his courtroom would be rocked by a case that would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice. Jasmine Crockett was there to defend her client, James Whitaker, a young man who had been accused of embezzling millions from a nonprofit organization. On the surface, the case appeared straightforward. Whitaker was the CFO of a charity that supported underprivileged children, and allegations had surfaced that he had misappropriated funds. The evidence was damning, the witnesses compelling, and the prosecution had prepared what seemed like an ironclad case. But Crockett wasn't so easily swayed. She had a feeling that something was off. She'd spent sleepless nights poring over the case file, digging through financial records, questioning witness testimonies, and retracing every step her client had taken. Judge Banks, however, was unimpressed by Crockett's enthusiasm. From the moment she entered the courtroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that her unconventional style was nothing but an attempt to avoid the inevitable verdict. Crockett had a reputation for bending the rules, if not breaking them altogether, and Banks wasn't a fan of such antics. As the trial unfolded, the courtroom grew tense. The prosecution painted Whitaker as a greedy, manipulative criminal who had taken advantage of a nonprofit to fund his lavish lifestyle. Witnesses testified to his lavish spending habits, including expensive vacations and luxury cars. The financial records appeared to support the claims. Jasmine Crockett, however, remained unflinching in her defense. With every piece of evidence the prosecution presented, she countered with a calm, calculated argument, showing discrepancies and inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. "Your Honor," Crockett said, as she stood up to address the judge, "what we have here is not a clear-cut case of embezzlement. There's something else going on, something deeper. My client has been accused of theft, but the evidence, when looked at from a different perspective, does not point to guilt. It points to something more sinister." Judge Banks raised an eyebrow, leaning forward in his chair. He had heard these kinds of statements before, but something about Crockett's tone intrigued him. He had a feeling she wasn't just playing for the crowd, but he wasn't yet convinced. "Miss Crockett," Judge Banks said, his voice even, "are you suggesting that my court is being misled by false evidence?" Crockett stood tall, her eyes locking with his. "No, Your Honor. I'm suggesting that the true story has yet to be told. If you would allow me the time to present my evidence, I'm certain I can prove my client's innocence." The room went silent as the tension mounted. The prosecution whispered among themselves, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. But Crockett wasn't intimidated. She knew the stakes were high, and she knew how to play the game. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Judge Banks was becoming increasingly frustrated. He had expected a quick trial and a straightforward conviction, but Crockett was pushing him into uncharted territory. Her arguments, though unconventional, were well-reasoned, and the more she spoke, the more the cracks in the prosecution's case began to show. The trial had been dragging on for hours, and Judge Banks was growing impatient. His patience with Crockett's constant objections was wearing thin. Yet, despite his reservations about her tactics, he couldn't deny that something about her defense was beginning to chip away at his initial certainty. Jasmine Crockett was no ordinary attorney. She wasn't just fighting for her client, she was fighting against an entire system that often overlooked the nuances of justice in favor of speed and simplicity. Every time the prosecution presented a new piece of evidence, she found a flaw, a hole in their argument that they hadn't anticipated. It wasn't that the evidence was fake, it was that there was something beneath the surface that no one had thought to question. As the day wore on, Judge Banks called for a brief recess. The courtroom emptied and the lawyers retreated to their respective corners. Crockett sat at her desk, rifling through the stack of documents she had compiled. Her mind raced, piecing together the last few details. She could feel it, the breakthrough was close. The defense team had already made headway by pointing out discrepancies in the timeline of financial transactions. But there was one part of the case that didn't add up. The testimony of one key witness, a former employee of the nonprofit, seemed off. Her statements didn't match the financial records, and there were small, subtle inconsistencies that Crockett had picked up on. But she needed something more concrete. Something that would force the judge to see what she saw. As the recess came to a close, Crockett stood and approached Judge Banks. The other lawyers were still deep in conversation with their teams, but Crockett knew this was her moment. She had to act swiftly before the judge's mind was made up. Your Honor, I respectfully request that we review the testimony of Karen Felton, the former employee who claimed to have knowledge of my client's alleged misappropriation of funds, Crockett said, her voice steady, but filled with determination. Judge Banks looked up from his notes, his expression unreadable. Ms. Crockett, we've already gone over this testimony. Are you suggesting we revisit it again? Crockett nodded. Yes, Your Honor. There's something there that hasn't been fully explored. If you allow me just one more chance to cross-examine Ms. Felton, I am confident I will uncover new information that will change the course of this trial. The judge hesitated. He wasn't sure if this was just another one of Crockett's delaying tactics, or if she was genuinely onto something. Finally, after a long pause, he gave a reluctant nod. Very well, Ms. Crockett. You may proceed with the cross-examination. The room fell silent as the attention shifted back to the witness stand. Karen Felton, a middle-aged woman with a stern face and an air of confidence, took her place. She had already testified that she had worked closely with James Whitaker and had witnessed firsthand the way he manipulated the financial records to cover up the theft. Jasmine Crockett approached the witness stand slowly, her eyes never leaving Felton's. Ms. Felton, thank you for your time today. I just have a few more questions for you. You've testified that you had access to all of the financial documents of the nonprofit, correct? Felton nodded, her gaze sharp. Yes, that's correct. Then, Crockett continued, can you explain why, in the transaction logs for the month of June, there appears to be an unusually large withdrawal that was never reported in any of the board meetings? A withdrawal that matches the exact amount of money that was allegedly misappropriated from the nonprofit. Felton's face remained neutral, but Crockett noticed a slight shift in her posture. It was a subtle thing, but it was enough for Crockett to know that she had hit a nerve. I don't know what you're talking about, Felton stammered. All of the transactions were accounted for. If there was a discrepancy, it must have been an error. Crockett leaned forward, her voice lowering but becoming more intense. An error, Ms. Felton? You're telling me that a transaction for over $100,000, an amount that no one seems to have questioned, was simply an error? Felton hesitated. I'm not sure what you're implying. Crockett's eyes narrowed. I think you do, Ms. Felton. I think you know exactly what I'm implying. That money didn't go missing. It was redirected. But not by my client. The courtroom was deathly silent. The prosecution exchanged uneasy glances. Judge Banks remained stoic, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Crockett turned back to the witness. I want you to think very carefully, Ms. Felton. Who else had access to the financial records? Who else would benefit from making this entire situation about my client? Felton's mouth opened and closed, her composure beginning to crack. She stopped, her gaze darting to the defense table, then quickly away. Your Honor, Crockett said, turning to Judge Banks, I request that we subpoena the phone records and financial accounts of Karen Felton. I believe she has information that has been deliberately withheld from this court. Judge Banks leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the desk. This was unexpected. He had expected Crockett to make another dramatic argument, but this was something entirely different. It was a revelation, one that could potentially turn the entire case upside down. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Judge Banks, who had initially been skeptical of Jasmine Crockett's unconventional methods, now found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the case. He had given her the opportunity to cross-examine the witness, but what she had unearthed was far more explosive than he had anticipated. Karen Felton, the former employee of the nonprofit, was now visibly shaken. Her confidence, once unshakable, had crumbled in the face of Crockett's relentless questioning. The prosecution team exchanged glances, whispering frantically among themselves. They hadn't expected this turn of events, and now they were scrambling to regain control of the narrative. Judge Banks, after a long pause, spoke. Ms. Crockett, your request to subpoena Ms. Felton's phone records and financial accounts is granted. We will reconvene tomorrow morning, and I expect all parties to be ready to present their findings. Crockett gave a brief nod, then returned to her seat, her face a mask of calm determination. She knew she had just struck a powerful blow in the case, but she also knew that this was only the beginning. The pieces were slowly falling into place, and she was more certain than ever that her client was innocent. It was just a matter of time before the truth came to light. The next morning, the courtroom reconvened and the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Both the defense and prosecution teams had spent the night poring over the newly acquired evidence. Crockett, however, was quiet, almost too calm. She knew she had the upper hand and she wasn't about to let the prosecution recover so easily. As the doors opened, Karen Felton was escorted back to the witness stand, her expression now one of defensiveness. The phone records and financial documents had been retrieved overnight, and it was clear that something had gone terribly wrong for Felton. Crockett rose from her seat and approached the stand. Ms. Felton, yesterday, you denied any knowledge of a missing transaction. However, after a thorough review of your phone records and financial accounts, we discovered something rather interesting. On the day the alleged embezzlement occurred, you made several phone calls to a number that corresponds with a private account linked to a shell company. A shell company, I might add, that is registered under your name. Felton's face went pale. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The prosecutor tried to interject, but Judge Banks raised a hand to silence him. Ms. Crockett, please continue, Judge Banks said, his voice filled with authority. Crockett turned back to the witness. I have a few more questions for you, Ms. Felton. Can you explain why you were in contact with this shell company on the day the nonprofit's funds were redirected? Can you explain why the records show that you transferred funds from the nonprofit's account to an offshore account that you control? Felton's eyes darted nervously. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think you do, Crockett countered. You see, Ms. Felton, the pattern is clear. The funds didn't just disappear. They were siphoned off by someone with access to the nonprofit's accounts. And that someone is you. Felton shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands trembling. She had nowhere to hide now. The evidence was overwhelming, and the defense had her cornered. It was only a matter of time before she would have to face the truth. The prosecution, realizing they had lost control of the case, began to raise objections, but Judge Banks, now fully engrossed in the revelations unfolding before him, waved them off. I'm afraid the court will allow Ms. Crockett to continue. We're not finished here. Crockett pressed on. In fact, Ms. Felton, it seems that you've been orchestrating a much larger scheme than anyone realized. You've been embezzling funds from this nonprofit for months, if not longer. And you've used my client as a scapegoat to cover your tracks. You thought that by pinning the blame on James Whitaker, you could escape the consequences. But now the truth is out. Felton's face crumpled, and for the first time, tears welled up in her eyes. She looked down, defeated. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I was desperate. I needed the money, and I thought I could cover my tracks. But when I saw the investigation starting, I panicked and thought if I could shift the blame onto James, I could get away with it. Crockett didn't take her eyes off Felton as she spoke. Your desperation doesn't excuse what you've done. You've not only ruined an innocent man's life, but you've also betrayed the trust of an entire organization that was trying to help children in need. There was a long pause, and then the entire courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. The truth had finally come to light, and it was worse than anyone had anticipated. Felton had manipulated the situation to her advantage, and Crockett had exposed her for the fraud she was. Judge Banks looked at Felton with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. Ms. Felton, you are charged with multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. You will be held accountable for your actions. The court will proceed with the sentencing phase tomorrow morning. As the proceedings wound down, Jasmine Crockett stood tall, her heart racing with a mix of triumph and relief. She had just uncovered one of the most elaborate schemes she had ever encountered in her career. But even more than that, she had proven something far more important. That justice wasn't just about following the rules. It was about seeking the truth, no matter where it led. She turned to James Whitaker, who had been sitting silently throughout the trial. His eyes were filled with gratitude, but also with disbelief. He had been accused of a crime he didn't commit, and thanks to Crockett's brilliance, his name had been cleared. He was free. Thank you, he said softly, his voice breaking. I don't know how to repay you. Crockett smiled. You don't have to. This is what I do. She turned to James Whittaker, who had been sitting silently throughout the trial. His eyes were filled with gratitude but also with disbelief. He had been accused of a crime he didn't commit, and thanks to Crockett's brilliance, his name had been cleared. He was free. Thank you, he said softly, his voice breaking. I don't know how to repay you. Crockett smiled. You don't have to. This is what I do. The following day, the courtroom was packed. The case had become a sensation, not just within legal circles but across the media. News outlets were covering the trial in real time, and public opinion had shifted dramatically in James Whittaker's favor. Many were in awe of Jasmine Crockett's skill and perseverance in uncovering the truth. Her ability to weave a complex web of legal and financial details into a coherent argument had made her an instant hero to the public. As the courtroom filled with murmurs, Judge Banks took his seat, and the proceedings for sentencing began. Jasmine Crockett sat at her table, her calm demeanor belying the gravity of the situation. Felton's fate was now in the hands of the court, but it wasn't just her future that would be decided in this moment. The outcome of this trial would have far-reaching implications for the nonprofit sector, the legal system, and the way financial crimes were investigated. Felton sat in the defendant's chair, her face pale and drawn. The remorse she had shown the day before was now tempered by the realization that her actions had consequences. She had thought she could manipulate the situation, pin the blame on James, and escape unscathed. But now she was facing a future of legal battles, prison time, and the loss of everything she had built. The prosecution delivered their closing statements, emphasizing the scale of Felton's crimes. They painted her as a ruthless, calculating individual who had destroyed the lives of countless people, including the nonprofit's beneficiaries, the employees who trusted her, and, of course, James Whittaker. They asked for the maximum sentence, citing her attempt to cover up her crimes by framing an innocent man. When it was Crockett's turn to speak, the room fell silent. She stood up and walked toward the judge's bench, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her posture was straight, her face serious, but there was no triumph in her expression. The battle had been won, but the war wasn't over. The damage caused by Felton's actions was far-reaching, and the work was far from finished. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady but filled with an undeniable authority, we stand here today not just to address the crimes of Karen Felton, but to send a message. A message that justice, no matter how long it takes, will always prevail. But also a message that, as a society, we cannot allow these systems to be so easily manipulated. The nonprofit sector, the place where so many people place their trust and hope, must be held to the highest standards of accountability. Crockett paused, letting her words sink in. While Felton's actions are reprehensible and she must be held accountable for her crimes, we must also address the larger issue at play here, the system that allowed her to operate unchecked for so long. It's not just about one individual. It's about an entire network of people who didn't ask the right questions. And it's about the people who were hurt along the way. She turned toward James Whittaker, who sat at the defense table, his hands folded in front of him. James Whittaker, despite the injustice he faced, has shown us that the fight for truth is never a solo endeavor. He's fought not just for his own reputation, but for the integrity of the nonprofit that was tarnished by these crimes. We owe it to him and to the people he's worked so hard to help to ensure that justice is not only served but that it is done in a way that prevents this from happening again. Her gaze shifted back to Felton, who was now slumped in her chair, a shadow of her former self. Karen Felton, you've chosen your path and now you must face the consequences. But know this, your actions have not only ruined your own life, they have left a mark on the very institution you once claimed to serve. And for that you must answer. Judge Banks, who had been listening intently, nodded. He understood the weight of her words. This trial had revealed deep flaws in a system that, while well-intentioned, was vulnerable to exploitation. He had seen it firsthand, how a single person, motivated by greed and self-interest, could cause ripples that affected so many others. After a long pause, Judge Banks spoke. The court will now proceed with the sentencing. Karen Felton, you are hereby convicted on multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Your actions have caused irreparable harm, not just to James Whittaker, but to the very people you swore to serve. For your crimes, you are sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Additionally, you will be required to pay restitution to the nonprofit, the amount to be determined. There was a collective sigh in the courtroom. The sentencing was harsh, but just. Felton, who had once been confident and self-assured, was now reduced to a woman facing the full consequences of her actions. As the court adjourned, Jasmine Crockett stood outside, her mind racing with the aftermath of the trial. Her client had been exonerated, but the case had left a mark on her as well. The work wasn't finished. There were still people like Felton out there, hiding in the shadows, manipulating the system for their own gain. But for now she had won. And as she stood there, surrounded by reporters eager for her statement, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. "I did what I had to do," she said softly, speaking into the microphone. "But the work doesn't end here. We need to make sure this never happens again." The days following the trial were a whirlwind for Jasmine Crockett. The media coverage was relentless and her name was now known across the country. She had become a symbol of integrity, a beacon of justice in a system that often seemed stacked against the little guy. But while the accolades were nice, Jasmine knew that her work was far from over. The nonprofit sector, the very cause that had brought this case to the forefront, was in turmoil. The damage done by Karen Felton was deep, and the trust that had been broken would take time to rebuild. But Jasmine had a unique perspective. She understood that true change didn't come from simply pointing fingers. It came from rolling up your sleeves and getting to work. James Whitaker, who had been cleared of all charges, was more determined than ever to continue his work. The nonprofit, though tarnished, still held immense potential to make a difference in the lives of those who needed it most. With the court case behind him, James was already looking forward to the future, planning the next steps for the organization. Jasmine met with him a few days after the trial, sitting across from him in his office. The atmosphere was quiet, almost contemplative. There was a sense of closure in the air, but also a recognition that the real challenges lay ahead. "I owe you everything, Jasmine," James said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You saved my life, and the work we've started here, this mission, it's bigger than I ever imagined. We need to make sure that this kind of thing never happens again. And we need your help." Jasmine nodded thoughtfully. She knew what he was asking. The nonprofit was going to need a complete overhaul, financial audits, stricter oversight, new systems in place to prevent future fraud. But beyond that, they needed something more profound. They needed a restoration of trust. "I'm not going anywhere," Jasmine replied. "But we can't do this alone. This will take everyone, your staff, your donors, the community. We need to rebuild it all from the ground up. And I'm happy to be here to help guide you through it." The room was quiet for a moment, and James looked at her, a newfound resolve in his eyes. "We're going to make it right. We'll show everyone that what happened here was an aberration, not the norm. And we'll make sure we're transparent every step of the way." While Jasmine was committed to helping James, she knew that her own journey was just beginning. The case with Karen Felton had thrust her into the limelight, but it had also given her a deeper understanding of the flaws within the system. The legal field was ripe for reform, and she was determined to be part of that change. The public recognition was a double-edged sword. She had made enemies in high places. People who didn't want their secrets exposed. People who would rather sweep issues under the rug than face them head-on. But Jasmine wasn't deterred. She had always known that true justice was never easy, and that fighting for what was right meant making sacrifices along the way. One afternoon, not long after the trial, Jasmine was approached by a prominent legal organization that specialized in financial crimes. They wanted to bring her onto their team, to expand their efforts to hold corporations and individuals accountable for illegal activities in the nonprofit sector. "You've done something extraordinary, Jasmine," the lead attorney said during their meeting. "Your work in the Whitaker case has set a new standard. We want you to lead our efforts to reform the way financial crimes are investigated. This is your chance to take what you've learned and use it to make a lasting impact." Jasmine sat back in her chair, processing the offer. It was tempting, an opportunity to make a difference on a larger scale, to use her skills to change the system from within. But as she thought about it, her heart kept returning to James and the nonprofit. She knew she had made a difference there, and the work was still far from done. She wasn't ready to leave that fight just yet. "I appreciate the offer, truly," she replied, meeting the attorney's gaze. "But I think my focus has to remain on the cause I started with. There's more work to do with James and the nonprofit. I have to make sure that the progress we've made isn't lost." The attorney nodded, understanding her decision. "I get it. But know that the offer is always open. Your talents are needed in places where change is possible on a larger scale." Jasmine left the meeting with a sense of peace. She had made her choice, and it felt right. The larger battle was still out there, but she wasn't ready to leave the front lines of the war she had started. Months passed, and with Jasmine's help, James Whitaker's nonprofit began to recover. The financial audits were completed and new systems were implemented to ensure transparency. The staff was reinvigorated and donors slowly started to return. It wasn't easy, but the nonprofit had a second chance and it was determined not to waste it. Jasmine continued to work behind the scenes, quietly guiding the process of rebuilding. She met with stakeholders, worked on compliance issues, and helped craft policies that would prevent future scandals. But more than anything, she helped restore hope. The nonprofit was no longer just a victim of one person's greed. It was a symbol of resilience, of standing up when the odds seemed insurmountable. And for Jasmine, it wasn't just about the success of the nonprofit. It was about proving that justice was more than a concept, it was an action. It was about standing up, speaking the truth, and never backing down, no matter the cost. In the end, Jasmine Crockett had not only cleared an innocent man's name, she had created a blueprint for justice. She had shown that even when the system is broken, there is always a way to make it work again. It wasn't just about winning the case, it was about changing the narrative. As she looked out at the growing success of the nonprofit and the changes she had helped bring about, Jasmine felt a sense of pride. She had made a difference. But more than that, she had started a movement. And in the end, that was worth everything.